Hey everybody, Keith Moore with Pros for One Source. Today what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk you through lubing your tip-up shaft. When it comes to keeping your tip-up shaft lubed, it's very important when you're out on the ice. As your tip-ups get older, water gets inside and they freeze from time to time from taking them out of the lake, putting them in a bucket, tipping them upside down. Water sits in there over time, and what that's going to do is it's going to corrode the shaft inside of your tip-up spool rod. And what that's going to do is entail there's not going to be any grease. It pushes the grease out from the ice building and the water and the rust, and then you end up with a shaft that won't spin freely. If you're on the ice and you're fishing walleyes in particular, and you don't have a very smooth spinning spool, they will drop it. They're going to grab that and they're going to feel it. They're going to go to take off and run. And a lot of times, as you know, if you're fishing for walleyes, they're only going to take off a couple of feet. Sometimes they grab it and sit there. And if there's any tension on the other end at all, they'll drop it. For pike, maybe not so much. A lot of times they're more aggressive. They're going to come up and they're going to smoke it. But then if they take off and they feel a ton of tension on the back end and that hook's not already in their face, the minnow that's hooked to the treble is either going to get ripped out as they take off or they're going to drop it. So having a real freely spinning spool is key when you're trying to catch nice fish on the ice. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk you through getting the shaft out of a tip-up and showing you how to re-lube it. There's a couple different things that you're going to need to get this project done. Today I'm going to be using Frabill Sub-Zero tip-up grease. There's a bunch of different companies out there, so it doesn't have to be this type of grease. Look them up. All the grease is good as long as it's a Sub-Zero type grease and it can handle cold weather. If it's made for tip-ups, it'll work. And you're going to need a couple pairs of pliers. A lot of times these tip-ups, if they're old and they're used, you'll be able to unspin these top nuts pretty much by hand, but you're going to need a pair of pliers for the lower nut underneath the T-bar. That way, a lot of times that second nut is seized in there if you haven't gone through and actually repacked your tip-up in a couple of years. So, also you're going to need a couple of rags. This makes a big mess, so I would either recommend doing this over your sink or over a piece of cardboard. That's what I've got. I've got a pretty good sized piece of cardboard underneath the tip-ups right now. Just something that's going to catch that grease. When we get this all apart, you're going to push that rod through, and you're going to be pushing all that old grease. Sometimes rust and water comes out of there too. And clean it out. You want to have something for that to land on. So just as a heads up, make sure you've got an area that you're okay with getting dirty, because this stuff might not ever come out, especially being grease. Paper towel is what I use for pushing through the rod to make sure that all the water and grease that's inside the tube, the outer tube, is actually cleared out before I decide to fill it back up with the new grease. You're going to start out with removing the top end. This has a rubber sleeve that fits over the threaded top of the shaft. We're going to take that off, and then you're going to go about removing the T-bar that the flag sits on. Just hold on to either the spool or use a pair of pliers on the nut below it. Spin that off. This tip-up has not been repacked in probably 2 years, and you can tell because when it gets real cold, she starts getting really stiff when we're fishing. So, alright, we got the T-bar off. Now we're going to remove the lower nut. Keep these all in line too, so you remember how these all go back on when you're done. And then there's a plastic sleeve on this tip-up. A lot of them might have a spring, like these ones here actually have a spring in the area where that plastic sleeve is, so the shaft can move up and down. This one does not, so pull off the plastic sleeve, and you're going to want to remove the line from the line keeper, and then that shaft will slide right out. You can see that this is really badly rusted. That doesn't mean that this thing is garbage. It'll still spin, but what you're going to need to do is you're going to need to sand that down. So that's another tool that you're going to have in your arsenal for working on these tip-ups if you come across that. Now, a lot of times I'll use a small piece of hand sandpaper, go with a real fine grit so you're not making huge grooves inside the shaft. That way it's going to sand it down smoothly and you're not going to have a lot of gaps to catch on it when it's spinning. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually grab a Dremel. I'm going to Dremel this thing down flat with light sandpaper, and then we're going to go about finishing the rest of the process. What I'm just going to do is sand this down until you don't see any more pitting in the shaft. Now we're ready to clean out the sleeve that your shaft will slide back into once we get the grease in there. To clean out the sleeve, we're going to have to take off the end caps. On this particular tip up, we've got 2 end caps. These are plastic, so you can pound them off by taking your sleeve, putting it in, and forcing it a little bit to one side, and giving it a good pop, and these will pop off. If you can't get it pounded off too, that's another reason I've got pliers. You can go through the shaft, kick it to one side, and use a hammer, or hit it with your hand, and that's going to pop that sleeve off. Or an easier way to do it, a pair of pliers, and give it a good couple of twists, and just work it away from the sleeve until it comes free. Do that with both ends. Now the 2 cap ends are off. You're going to remove your line keeper. Now we can go to cleaning out the inside of the sleeve. Easiest way I found to cleaning out the sleeve, if you really want to make a mess and you want to make sure you get all the rust and grease out of there, I'd recommend using a spray brake cleaner. That's going to get it completely out. And brake cleaner dries off really fast, so it doesn't leave a lot of residue in there when you decide to re-grease your shaft. So I usually take the tip-up shaft, I grab a little piece of paper towel and fold that up, make it just big enough to fit inside the sleeve. So it's actually tight when you slide that in the sleeve. The whole point of this is to keep it tight enough where it's going to grab everything on the edges when you push it through. Get rid of all that old grease and rust and build up in water. Now you're going to take your shaft, slide that through, and that's all the old grease. You can see there's a lot of rust build up and other stuff in there. So you got the sleeve completely cleared out. Next comes your grease. Now you've got the sleeve completely cleared out, you're going to take your grease, put your tip up on a stable area so the rod can't wobble back and forth. Take your grease tube, put that on top of the end of the sleeve, push down with one hand, and squeeze the grease in at the same time. You're going to get a little grease that's going to overlap on the outside edges as you slip. The whole point of this is just to get the grease down into the rod as far as possible. I've got about 2 inches in here on the other end, so I'm going to use this excess grease and I'm going to push that down into the sleeve. Just keep working that grease in. When you put the shaft through it, what's going to happen is the air gaps and stuff, it's going to push a lot of the grease out. So you want to get as much in there as you can. This is where it gets messy. You're going to have a place to throw that excess grease as you're doing this. Make sure that when you do this, you've got everything here, all the parts put back together before you slide that shaft back in. So you're going to need your line keeper, then you're going to need your end caps. What we're going to do is we're going to pound these back on each end. Next step, you're going to take your shaft, you're going to slide that through the sleeve. Keep in mind that as you slide this through, there's going to be a lot of air pressure that's going to pop out the top of the sleeve. What I like to do is keep my finger on this end, and it's going to try to push. You'll feel the air pressure on your finger. Just hold it and go nice and slow to ensure that the air pressure comes out the base sleeve instead of the top sleeve, and it keeps your grease inside that sleeve. Alright, I'm just through now. You heard a little bit of air pop through there. Now I'm going to clean off this excess grease on the shaft and then reassemble. Now this is where it becomes important that you kept your parts all in line if you don't have another one to look at to make sure that you're going to have your parts on exactly the way they came off. I keep them in line on the table. Plastic sleeve goes on. After that goes the nut. You're going to wind that all back down. Keep in mind that the shaft has to be able to move a little bit, and it does have to have a little bit of play, so you can't take this nut and crank it all the way down, because what that's going to do is it's going to make it almost impossible to spin the sleeve. So what I like to do is I back it off just enough where you can feel a little bit of wiggle in that shaft, and then you put your next T-bar on. Now this is one of the main reasons that you need pliers, just to be able to get this tight enough where when you're out on the ice this isn't going to loosen up on you. You're going to take your pliers, you're going to hold that first nut, and then you're going to tighten that T-bar down to it. And now you still got enough play in there where this can spin completely freely. Last step, put the rubber cap on, push that back down in place, and you got a completely re-lubed tip up for your next time out. This one's going to spin, and you can tell it already spins way smoother than it used to. You can pull it off without barely even trying. So hopefully that helps you out, and you don't have to buy new tip ups every year. You can get yourself a tube of grease, get yourself some tools and some rags, clean them all up, and your tip ups will last a lot longer.